Welcome to Renegading. It was the respected US Army General George S Patton Jr. who famously said, "If everyone is thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking." His extensive experience of war gives gravity to his insight. Today, even after so many official lies, when we speak about reasons to go to war, it seems that there must be total public compliance. It's now apparently unpatriotic to ever question official narratives, so all dissenting voices must be totally crushed. But where does this absolutism logically lead? And how do we resist a militarised herd mentality that will lead to bigger geopolitical conflicts that could end in mutually assured destruction? Joining me to discuss war, propaganda and crushing dissent are the co-director of the Organisation for Propaganda Studies, Dr. Piers Robinson, and lecturer in international politics at University of Leicester, Tara McCormack. Welcome to you both. Tara, when we look at the UK today, and we look at the political scene and we look at society, where's the anti-war movement, as you see it?
Well, I think today there isn't really an anti-war movement, and I think that's a real problem. If you look back 60s, 70s, 80s, to be anti-war, anti-Western militarism was an understood political position.
Right.
In the mainstream media, you would have people like John Pilger, you'd have papers like The Guardian before they became fully bought out by the security services, but it would be a respected position in academia. Think about the sort of anti-war movement, LSE, people like Tariq Ali. So it might not have been the biggest movement, but it was a respected, understood political position. And you had a criticism of Western foreign policy that was made in a broader political framework, a criticism of Western power, imperialism and so on. So you absolutely did have, as well at the same time, government smears, all sorts of things going on. But nonetheless, you still had that kind of backdrop that to be critical of Western foreign policy was an understood political position. And I think what happens in the early 90s, end of the Soviet Union, of course, and the rise of humanitarian intervention, reframing of conflicts such as the Yugoslav breakup and wars as a new Holocaust, you have the kind of end of that political understanding of Western war as problematic. In the 90s, many people on the left entirely move away from any kind of criticism of Western war. There's an embrace of NATO. Our bombs are good. Our bombs can liberate and bring human rights. And I think that's a real problem. I think there was still something left in the late 90s, but also even in the 90s, you had politicians in parliament such as Tony Benn, Tam Dalyell, who, for example, when it came to Kosovo in 1999, stood up and said, and were very supportive of the very small anti-war movement I was involved, who stood up and said, this is wrong, and we just don't have that anymore. So now all that we are left with are kind of, government attacks, smears in the media, for example. And whilst you certainly had that during the Cold War, you also had that kind of core political argument. You had colleagues and comrades, people who'd understand that that was a legitimate political argument. Agree or disagree, it was a legitimate political position, and that's gone. So now all we're left with, people who do want to argue against Western foreign policy, is a kind of very complacent and compliant media.
And some would argue a corporate media who clearly have an agenda. Because what's happened, as you pointed out, communism was defeated, and then there's been this sort of triumphalism with capitalism. And that's sort of taken us to here, which means that you vanquish any voice that doesn't agree with you.
Yeah, I think that's probably a more complicated discussion about what happened there in terms of media. I'm not sure I kind of quite have the straightforward answer to why we've just had that. In a way, the establishment, I think, is actually weaker and more incoherent than it was. But that's a very broad brush, kind of account for the narrowing.
The narrowing of the political discourse, the narrowing of the political space, the attacks and the smears, you know a little bit about this. Why is there such a ferocity when people are smeared, like as you have been? And what is the effect of the narrowing of the discourse?
What are the effects of the smearing? I mean, these are tactics ultimately, which are employed in order to discredit the reputation of the messenger. It's about destroying their credibility so that what they're saying will not be listened to. That's the purpose of this. Now, I don't think that everyone who engages in smearing people necessarily know exactly what they're up to in that respect, but some people do and know this is a kind of a dirty PR tactic and so on. And so these things are designed to destroy somebody's credibility, to stop other people from listening to them. And they're also designed to intimidate that individual. You know, do you really want to be trolled, smeared, and have nasty newspaper articles written about you? And what might your employer think about that, even if it's a good university which has a robust defence of freedom of speech? You know, it's not necessarily the kind of thing that is going to get people popping the champagne in the PR department. So all of those things create a huge amount of pressure, and that's what they're designed to do. They're designed to undermine people. It's obviously not a rational process. It's not logical. There's no reasoned debate going on here.
But it's age-old, isn't it? The ad hominem, play the man, not the ball.
Yeah, sure. It's age-old, but it's probably intensified in recent years.
Why?
Why? I think that politics, in a sense, has become more extreme, but also the circumstances of the conflicts that we're talking about have become more extreme. If we see the West as being at a particular historical juncture where it's weakening in the international system in relation to, for example, China, India, and so on. The West, as we know, has been engaging in a very belligerent war-fighting strategy for many years now. That's an extreme policy, right? Okay. Engaging in an invasion of Iraq, for example. If you were to talk to myself or you in the 90s or 80s and say, well, actually, we're going to be invading Iraq with tanks and soldiers in 2003, we would have been taken aback. So these are extreme policies which are being pushed through, highly destructive. And in that situation, how do you control dissent? And the narrative. You can't do it anymore through reasoned discussion, and so what you do instead is you then try and take people out effectively. Don't listen to Piers, don't listen to Tara because they're Assad apologists or they're anti-Semites or they're Islamophobic, etc. Because that's the reality. You're talking about the facts of what's going on, and people don't want those facts to surface and people to realise what's going on. And so you had to take people out and you had to employ nasty tactics to do it. Tobacco industry engaged in that kind of stuff in the 70s and 80s, trying to close down the emerging scientific consensus on tobacco's harmful effects and lung cancer links. And there were some pretty dirty tactics being employed then against scientists.
And can you sort of transpose what happened then on what's happening now to academics, people, dissenting journalists and alternative media?
Yeah, I mean, these tactics, this attempt to control debate and control the information environment, in some ways, I mean, I think there are multiple sources of, say, the attacks and smears against us as academics, and we could possibly talk for quite some time about where we think that's coming from. But, you know, from a fairly straightforward public relations, you know, there's nice, positive, fluffy public relations, persuading people, and then there's the kind of nastier side of it and so on, taking people out, discrediting people, looking for dirt, digging for dirt.
And of course that has a chilling effect on the wider community because you are called, for instance, a conspiracy theorist or a Assad apologist or Putin's puppet, whatever it is, and people are embarrassed to associate with that.
Yeah, this is about demonising and marginalising people who are often telling the truth and who are often telling uncomfortable truths. Chomsky's familiar with this. This happened to him in the 1970s. He was accused, I think, of things such as, you know, Holocaust, genocide denial, etc., being pro-communist and so on. This has all been used before. But these things do work unless you put yourself in a position as somebody who's attacked where you realise that, well, this is what this is. This is just to try and close you down. And as John Pilgers has said, that these attacks in the short term, you know, that they're not very pleasant, but in the long term, you tend to find you're vindicated, and people realise that because, you know, you are there staying with a factual, truthful discussion, and over time, you know, when things have moved on and you haven't got those forces geared towards smearing you, they're gone, then people realise that, okay, well, you know, Tara was correct and Piers was correct and that working group was correct on Syria. So, you know, you get vindicated in the long run, and if you realise that, you ride through it. It becomes a badge of honour, okay? You know, you can always say, you know, if you're not being attacked like this as an academic, then you're not doing your job as an academic.
But that is the point, isn't it? And same for the media, that, you know, once you're over the target, the flak increases, you take more flak, and it's very obvious that could be the case.
But I just want to jump in, but then to go back to what I was saying earlier, but the real difference is now there isn't that, you know, even though it was small, there isn't that kind of backdrop of an alternative political argument. And that's, I think, the real difference. So in the 70s and 80s, attacks on Chomsky, but you had a strong anti-war movement. We don't, and that's the real problem. It's just a few people, and that's the kind of real difference.
And I think you're absolutely right. And if you think about it, it's absolutely incredible. You look at the war in Syria. This is a 7-8 years long war with massive involvement from Western countries, Gulf state allies, and so on. And look at the number of academics who even have the faintest idea of what's actually going on. It's remarkable. Yeah. And that tells you that is a strong indication of how weak, as you say, we are in terms of robust intellectual thinking, which provides not just access to the truth, but also just a challenge to the political drive we've had towards war.
And literally, I have found, even to sort of talk about, Western funding of groups that, we would declare a national emergency if they turned up in Birmingham or London. Right. One is called all sorts of names, pro-Assad, etc., just for pointing out actually an established fact that is established in papers of record, which obviously are problematic. But, you can read in the New York Times about what the groups that America has sponsored, that we have helped, the BBC even on occasion. So it's a quite incredible thing whereby actual reality is almost denied.
If we carry on down this track, where does it logically lead?
I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. I like to be optimistic.
These things can be made complicated or they can be described in fairly simple terms.
Right.
We've been involved in a number of wars over the last 18 years. We know that there are people who want to push us into a war with Iran, okay? And there are clearly elements in the Western establishment across the West who are quite happy to go up against China and Russia in the long term. So where this can all lead, if there isn't some kind of rational debate and some kind of proper check, it can lead us to simply more war. And this isn't speculative, right? We've been involved in wars. We are involved. We're on a war footing. We have been since 9/11. And where we can go with this is that we just get into worse and worse conflicts. At the moment, we seem to be checked, or its drive for war is checked, and it seems that Iran is not likely to be attacked. But that's not, that could still happen. We get to that point, attacking Iran, and we get into a confrontation with Russia or China, then we're into, do I need to say it? We're into a potential major global conflict. That's where we can end up with this vacuum that we have at this point in time.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc. Before we talk more about the need for a new anti-war movement with Piers Robinson and Tara McCormack, let's have a look at what you've been tweeting about in this week's Renegade Inc. Index. First up, we've got a tweet from Rania Kalek. In 2003, these people would have called us pro-Saddam. In the 60s, they'd have called us pro-Viet Cong. The pro-war narrative dominates the entire establishment. Anyone who digresses from that narrative is smeared and ostracised. Piers, know anything about that?
That's vaguely familiar to me. You do raise questions and so on. That's what ends up happening to you.
Next up from Mark Curtis, Britain's indirect involvement in Yemen, says Guardian, Lord in heaven, please stop the disinformation.
This really is one of the most astonishing achievements, I think, of the British media of late, which is to wholeheartedly ignore the established fact that Britain is an absolutely central player in the war against Yemen. And it's not just about selling weapons, but we support the weapons. We have special forces in the British soldiers that are actually training Saudi military. I mean, this is literally a war that without us could not happen.
Next from Ian Cobain, journalists banned from Europe's biggest arms fair. Why? What don't they want us to see? This is the article from Middle East Eye, which is detailing that journalists have been blocked from the DSEI arms fair.
Middle East Eye is a really good publication because it genuinely does publish articles reflecting different political viewpoints, and it's one of the few places that will kind of publish critical articles as well. Ian Cobain writes them, for example.
And finally, from Malinka Tanya P, there was no independent confirmation of the chlorine attack on Idlib at the time. Pompeo, the US is providing a new $4.5 million to the OPCW. Pompeo couldn't present any plausible proof of this alleged attack, so now US buy the answers they want from the independent OPCW. What's your view on this, the politicisation or the donation and potential politicisation of an organisation like the OPCW?
Well, if you're a cynical person, you might think there's a bit of bribery going on, but there's certainly an element of incentivisation going on there in order to encourage the OPCW to find and reach conclusions which are going to be compatible with what they want and the claim that they want to stand up. So bribery, if you want to call it bribery, if you want to be objective and neutral, it's incentivisation. That's incentivisation going on there.
When we think of what's gone on in Syria, you were very quick to raise fundamental questions, specifically about the Duma incident. Why did that stand out to you as to ask independent and critical questions about what was going on there?
Well, in terms of the working group, a number of us have been looking at chemical weapon allegations in Syria prior to Duma. And there was already plenty of reasons to question the dominant narrative that the Syrian government was carrying out chemical weapons attacks.
On its own people?
On its own people. So there's already questions in our mind and evidence that there were problems. And then, of course, Duma happened. And immediately with Duma, of course, West, France, US and UK were pushing the narrative that it was the Syrian government who were responsible. The usual voices, the Elliot Higgins and Bellingcat and so on, were pushing the idea that it was the Syrian government. And of course, at the time, the position was that, well, we need this to be looked at properly, objectively. It needs to be a proper investigation rather than to jump the gun. Right. But of course, they jumped the gun and they bombed within 7 days and then attacked us relentlessly for having raised questions. And in a sense, that just made it even more suspicious that there's something going on here. They didn't even want to wait for the OPCW report, etc.
When the OPCW then get involved in this specific case, what was that process? How does that process look?
Well, from what we know now, of course, Duma happened, the famous yellow cylinders, and a significant number of civilians were killed in Duma, followed by the air attacks from France, UK and America. The investigation, the OPCW did get in and they investigated. And what we found when the final OPCW report was published in 2019 was a report which was clearly had significant anomalies in it. Okay?
What were those anomalies?
The key anomalies was, first and foremost, the idea or the kind of explanation of how the cylinders had arrived at their locations was unpersuasive, to put it mildly.
Just clarify that for you. How did they arrive and how was it claimed that they arrived?
The OPCW report clearly implied that the cylinders had been dropped by helicopters and that they had fallen into apartments, and that's where the chlorine gas had leaked from. Number 2 anomaly was that the deceased civilians at location 2 in the apartment block, the OPCW investigation found only that chlorine was present, okay, so therefore implying that these people were killed by chlorine, but the report also noted that they appeared to have died due to some kind of fast-acting nerve agent, okay, because chlorine doesn't kill rapidly. So you had a stark inconsistency in the report in terms of how the people had died. The third big problem were the hospital scenes. I mean, we knew because Riyam Dalati from the BBC has claimed and still continues to claim the hospital scenes were staged. And you look at the Duma report and there are indications even there of staging of the hospital scenes. So you add all of those things together and you've got a lot of very serious questions about what really happened and increasing ultimately the probability that it was a staged event. Okay.
Wow, and that's a big claim.
And that's a big claim. And then, of course, the key thing is that you have the OPCW report coming out, and then within a few weeks of that, you have the leaking of an internal engineering report carried out by people who were the team in Duma, and that was leaked, and it was obviously leaked to us, and we published it. But that report was essentially the opposite conclusion of the OPCW report. The conclusion was that the cylinders were most probably put there by hand, not dropped by helicopters. The problem that we have identified in the OPCW, and the problem that we have identified both through obviously leaked material, etc., but also looking at earlier cases, is that you have an organisation which has been set up in terms of the Syrian investigations in a way which allows them to rely upon opposition groups for information, and that has ultimately fed through to reports which wouldn't stand up in a normal criminal court, okay, because the information which is being relied upon. So you have some kind of pressure going on. You also have a placement of officials into key positions, it would appear, which mean that the interests of France, UK, and the US are being reflected by essentially the organisation itself. And we all know anybody who works in a big organisation, you put the right people, you get the right people into key positions, they can ensure that things go in a particular direction. And this is what we understand as exactly what happened with Duma, is that there was an engineering report carried out by the people who were sent in, which clearly concluded that you have some kind of staged event most likely to have occurred there. And that documentation gets suppressed. It gets sort of ruled out of the final report. And that's why there's the controversy now. That's why there's ongoing controversy and questions. But this is what happens. You have essentially a corruption of the independence of the OPCW. The real danger, this is not really to do with Syria in a sense, okay? Because of course we get smeared as being pro-Assad and Russian propaganda, etc., in relation to Syria, but there's a much bigger issue at stake.
What is that issue?
And that bigger issue is if you have an organisation such as the OPCW, which is effectively corrupted by major powers in the international system, they can then use the OPCW to create a justification for attacking another country and for war.
Who's going to stand up and say, actually, the OPCW needs to be fit for purpose again and not have this corrupted process that you're talking about?
I mean, I don't know, because I think you always have this problem with international institutions, effectively, that the powerful states can, to some extent, push the agenda. I mean, I'm just thinking about, say, Iraq, you know, the weapons inspectors, and Iraq turfed them out saying, no, you know, the weapons inspectors are also spying for Israel. Of course, great denial, but, you know, 3 years after the Iraq war, that was established as a fact. So it's not new to have these kind of international organisations and mechanisms that essentially can be corrupted and follow a Western agenda rather than actually try and find out what has happened. But I don't really know the answer to that.
People need to speak out, and this clearly has already happened, okay, with documents being leaked from the OPCW. And frankly, you know, in terms of the OPCW, the non-aligned movement, Russia, China, India, they as states and actors, they can put pressure to get the OPCW reformed. And rather than just going, oh, well, okay, we all know that the Syria stuff was, you know, manipulated, etc., they can say, well, no, we need to properly confront this in the organisation. So there's a responsibility not just for us and publics when we realise the truth, there's a responsibility for other states in the international system to say, right, the OPCW. And my understanding is that sort of non-aligned movement, etc., and then, of course, Russia, but also India, China, there's widespread scepticism.
Just a couple of things, just as we're talking, thinking again about Iraq and Chilcot. Obviously, Piers has written at length about. Here was an absolutely astonishing report produced by the government itself, you know, and you see this sometimes, you know, but it's always way after the fact. Think the House of Commons report on Libya, which is pretty critical. It's a pretty astonishing report, and Chilcot himself says this has to be something that we take with us going into the future. And what is it treated as? It is treated as a historical accident. I guess that's why I feel more pessimistic, because I worry, you know, well, but whatever comes out about the OPCW, it will come out and it will be a scandal, but just as with Chilcot, and then we move on. And then because of the way in which the media currently functions, I mean, you would literally think, when you look at the reports about Syria, Iraq didn't happen. As part of Chilcot, there are emails released between, or memos, I can't remember, released between Blair and Bush. You know, you can find it on the BBC, published it. Blair literally saying, we need to establish an Al-Qaeda connection with Saddam Hussein, otherwise the European and British public will not buy the war. Last April, when Britain, America and France bombed Syria, that was in the face, in Britain, of public opposition to the bombing. Now, that wasn't public opposition to the bombing saying, well, OK, if it was the Syrian government, we support bombing. That was public opposition saying, no, whatever the case, we do not agree with the bombing. And the same in America, the public are consistently far less belligerent than the political establishment. The problem is, you know, there's a huge gap between public attitudes to war. So there isn't a coherent, vocal anti-war movement, but generally people don't think war is a good idea.
Right. So as we conclude, what we've identified, if you're going to pick a sort of working surface, if you like, the gap between the political class, the public, and within that gap, all manner of the stuff that we don't want to happen, whether it be imperialism, Western exceptionalism, military adventurism, they can get away with it. And until we shine a light there, this is going to go on and on.
Yeah, it will go on and on, but these things only go on for a certain period of time. War fighting, imperialism can exist for a certain period of time, and at some point, the establishment, the forces that be, become exhausted with this. And I think that's probably the point we're at the moment. I guess what I'm saying here is I think circumstances are going to force things, and circumstances are going to force the voices such as myself and Tara and others to actually come to the fore ultimately, and we'll start to cohere, and then we'll provide sort of a more robust analysis and a check on what's going on. The awareness of, the skepticism about the mass media now is at record level, right? The institutionally is really collapsed in many ways. And that's the first step in, as it were, people liberating themselves and political change ultimately.
I think that is true. The media, sometimes I do sort of see headlines now. I think, the media must know as well that they're more and more just talking to that, what's called, the Westminster bubble, especially around foreign policy. There is much greater scepticism. There's a lot of indifference, as well. But
people feel generally powerless. That's the indifference. Because they say, well, what can I do about it? I mean, little or me. And by the way, look at Brexit, all the rest of it. They're not listening to us. The political class are not listening to us. What can I do?
We're not at the point of mobilisation. There is, people are divided, people feel disempowered and so on. That's the next step. When people realise that the system is not working, things are broke, whether it's neoliberalism or war, etc. I think that realisation is there. Now, the next step is some kind of mobilisation, which then starts to affect political change. I think 10, 15 years down the line, if everything goes the way that I hope it will, I think people will look back on this period as a terrible period in Western history where we were involved in initiating, instigating and fueling war after war after war, incredibly destructive. And at some point, that came to an end.
We finish with optimism. Piers, Tara, thank you very much for your time. That's it from Renegade Inc. this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us @RenegadeInc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.